unjust. And here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report, I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue on this Occupy Wall Street protest, we're joined by one of the organizers, David Graeber. David Graeber is author of Debt, The First 5,000 Years. He teaches at Goldsmiths at the University of London, teaches anthropology. You're in the United States right now. Welcome. You were part of the protest, stayed there overnight. Talk about how this all got organized, David.
Well, it was originally a call from Adbusters. It was just sort of thrown out into the blue.
And explain what Adbusters is.
Adbusters, the magazine based in Toronto, so they're quite far away from Wall Street. They had this conception and they thought they could bring it into being. A bunch of us showed up, relatively unprepared for what to expect on August 2nd when they called a general meeting. And after a little bit of uncertainty, we sort of started putting together a process. We decided to model on the idea of the sort of horizontal direct democracy they had in Europe. And in a way, the Wall Street action was one focus, but the very idea of building that kind of General Assembly movement was a lot of what we were really about.
And explain what you mean by General Assembly and exactly how the process started on Saturday.
Well, what people are doing in Europe is essentially trying to reinvent democracy. The idea is that, all of the political parties have basically bankrupted themselves. They're all essentially bought and sold by the financial elite that's created this crisis. There's no possibility of their actually coming up with a solution. And essentially, you have to start over. People have to go into their public squares, meet each other, start talking to each other, and start brainstorming of ideas. I mean, essentially, the idea is the system is not going to save us. We're going to have to save ourselves. So we're going to try to get as many people as possible to camp in some public place and start rebuilding society as we'd like to see it.
How many people turned out?
Well, at first we were a little worried at Bowling Green, but more and more people kept showing up. So I ended up helping to facilitate a meeting which was at least 2,000 people.
During a radio interview, New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg drew a comparison between demonstrators in Occupy Wall Street and those participating in the Arab Spring.
You have a lot of kids graduating college, can't find jobs. That's what happened in Cairo. That's what happened in Madrid. You don't want those kinds of riots here.
Well, in a way, he's prescient, because if you look at who showed up, it was mostly young people, and most of them were people who'd gone through the educational system, who were deeply in debt, and who found it completely impossible to get jobs. I mean, these people have really feel very strongly that they did the right thing. They did exactly what they were supposed to. The system has completely failed them, and they're not going to be saved by the people in charge. You're just going to if there's going to be any kind of society worth living in, we're going to have to create it ourselves.
Let me ask you about President Obama's announcement of the Buffett rule. As we're broadcasting now, he has not yet made that announcement. Chairman of the House of Representatives Budget Committee, Paul Ryan, was critical. He said higher levels of taxation on the wealthy would reduce job creation and investment. Ryan was speaking on Fox News Sunday.
If you tax something more, Chris, you get less of it. If you tax job creators more, you get less job creation. If you tax investment more, you get less investment. At a time when experts are telling us, including, like I said, the Fiscal Commission, we should lower tax rates on investment and job creation by getting rid of all the loopholes so we can create economic growth. So we think this is going in the wrong direction. Let's not forget that under current law that the president's already passed, the top tax rate on individuals and small businesses in 2013 goes to about 44.8%. So we have employers here in Wisconsin that pay that tax rate who are competing against countries that are taxing their businesses from like 16% in Canada, almost 21% going in England, 25% in China. The world taxes their businesses at about 25%, and he's saying we're going to tax these job creators at above 45% with this new tax. What it does is it adds further instability to our system, more uncertainty, and it punishes job creation and those people who create jobs. Class warfare, Chris, may make for really good politics, but it makes for rotten economics.
Class warfare, David Graeber?
Well, generally speaking, when you hear a Republican talk about class warfare, you know they're waging it. I think that the easiest way to put what's going on in perspective is to think about the situation in the 50s under Eisenhower, who was, of course, a Republican president, when tax rates on the wealthiest were actually 90%. I don't remember the economy freezing up and falling apart in the 1950s. In fact, it was booming. In the 60s, the same thing. We're not talking about some radical proposal. We're talking about inching back, a tenth of the way back to where we were when America was at its wealthiest. So I think that rhetoric is just completely false.
I want to go to Warren Buffett himself, part of the White House deficit reduction plan aimed at ensuring people who earn more than $1 million a year pay a minimum rate of tax that at least matches that of middle-class families. Dubbed the Buffett tax, the proposal's named after billionaire U.S. investor Warren Buffett, who wrote earlier this year, rich people like him often pay less in taxes than those who work for them. Well, last year, Buffett spoke to ABC News and dismissed Republican arguments that letting tax cuts expire for the wealthy would hurt economic growth.
I think that people at the high end, people like myself, should be paying a lot more in taxes. We have it better than we've ever had it.
They say you have to keep those tax cuts, even on the very wealthy, because that is what energizes business and capitalism.
The rich are always going to say that, just give us more money and we'll go out and spend more, and then it'll all trickle down to the rest of you. But that has not worked the last 10 years, and I hope the American public is catching on.
That was Warren Buffett being interviewed by Christian Amanpour of ABC. This is Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, speaking on Meet the Press Sunday, dismissive about the so-called Buffett rule.
If Warren Buffett would like to give up some of his benefits, we'd be happy to talk about it. I mean, I think that means testing benefits is one of the ways that we're going to have to solve at least the Social Security and Medicare problems long-term for the next generations. With regard to his tax rate, if he's feeling guilty about it, I think he should send in a check. But we don't want to stagnate this economy by raising taxes.
That was Mitch McConnell. Your response, David Graeber.
Well, I think the most obvious response is that this has nothing to do with economics at all. I think that for the last 30 years, we've seen a political battle being waged by the super rich against everyone else, and this is the latest move in this shadow dance, which is completely dysfunctional economically and politically. I mean, it's the reason why young people have just abandoned any thought of appealing to politicians. We all know what's going to happen. The tax proposals are sort of a mock populist gesture, which everyone knows will be shot down. What will actually probably happen would be more cuts to social services. The very fact that the rhetoric is about the debt, which is really a non-issue, is itself the problem.
What do you mean it's a non-issue?
Well, again, American debt has been much higher than this in the past, and American economy boomed. In fact, people turned to the debt as an issue when it became obvious that the real problems faced by Americans, unemployment most obviously, and the state of the economy, basically couldn't be addressed by the political system as it currently exists.
How should unemployment and poverty and inequality be addressed?
Well, it has always been addressed in the past by further deficit spending, which will cause the economy to grow again, and then the money can be recouped. This has always worked in the past.
And so how do you think President Obama is dealing with this?
I think President Obama really bought into the dominant ideology, which is essentially Republican. Finally, he has to wage an election campaign, so he has to make some gestures in the other direction, because he knows that overwhelming majorities of the American public are in favor of taxing the rich. And he also knows that it's almost certainly going to be shot down. There's nothing that the Republicans are less likely to put up with than a proposal like this.
David Graeber, talk about debt cancellation.
Well, one of the things that I discovered in researching my book is that the kind of debt crisis we're experiencing now, the real debt crisis, which is a debt crisis that affects ordinary people, debts between the very wealthy or between governments can always be renegotiated and always have been throughout world history. They're not anything set in stone. It's generally speaking when you have debts owed by the poor to the rich that suddenly debts become a sacred obligation, more important than anything else. The idea of renegotiating them becomes unthinkable. In the past, though, there have been mechanisms when things get to a point of real social crisis that have always existed, and they vary by the period of history. In the ancient Middle East, often new kings would simply declare a clean slate and cancel all debts, or all consumer debts, commercial debts between merchants were often left alone. The Jubilee was a way of institutionalizing that. In the Middle Ages, there were bans on interest-taking entirely. There have been many mechanisms, but whenever you have what I call a period of virtual credit money, when money is recognized not to be a thing like gold and silver, but a social relation, a promise that people make to each other, which has become increasingly clear since the 70s when we went off the gold standard, and I think 2008 really brought that home. Debts can be renegotiated. They're not set in stone. Trillions of dollars of debt was made to disappear. We understand now that this is a political arrangement, and it can always be readjusted. And I think what the people coming to the squares, and Wall Street now included, are saying is that, well, if that's true, if democracy is going to mean anything now, we're all going to have to be able to weigh in on what sort of promises are made and what sort of promises are adjusted when you enter into a crisis.
We hear about debt cancellation when we're talking about developing nations. What about the United States?
Well, the interesting thing is that most of the developing nations have actually pulled themselves out of this situation. It's structural adjustment has come home to Europe and America. I think it would be a great idea. I think it would bring home that we really are in a different age, that money doesn't mean the same thing as it used to. And there are people who've tried it. Saudi Arabia, actually, most dramatically, that was their reaction to the Arab Spring. They declared a debt cancellation. So there are precedents. I mean, they kind of don't want people to know that they did it for obvious reasons, but they did.
And the crisis now in Europe?
The crisis now in Europe is an example of the same thing. The austerity regimes that are being imposed now on Europe and on America are remarkably similar to what happened, what used to be called the Third World Debt Crisis. First, you declare a financial crisis, you bring in these people who are supposedly neutral technocrats who are in fact enforcing this extreme neoliberal ideology. You bypass all democratic accountability and impose things that no one ever possibly have agreed to. It's the same thing. And one reason it's happening to us now is that there was really successful mobilization around the world against those policies. I mean, in a lot of ways, the global justice movement was successful. The IMF was kicked out of East Asia. It was kicked out of Latin America. And now it's come home to us.
I want to thank you for being with us.